These Maps Don't Lie, Making Racial Inequity Visible with Geospatial Data. It's a second webinar in a 3-webinar series, so let's just hold for a minute. We're expecting over 500 of you today. Of course, we'll see all the questions that we receive. We received a lot after our first webinar and a request for additional webinars, so we're working on those. So welcome again. If you're just joining us from Facebook and LinkedIn, you have joined the second webinar in a 3-webinar series, These Maps Don't Lie, Making Racial Inequity Visible with Geospatial Data. Let me just hold for about 30 seconds until I get the high sign that we've got our live stream good and going. You're going to like today's webinar, folks. You may remember the first one. We'll talk about that in a second. And it looks like we can go ahead and start. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lynn Pretty, president of Claremont Lincoln University, and you have joined a second in a 3-webinar series on structural racism, how it's happened, the reality of past practice, and what we can do to confront and change it. The webinar series is a collaboration between Claremont Lincoln University and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Now, if you don't know the Lincoln Institute, well, check it out. It's an extraordinary nonprofit foundation focused for 75 years, folks, on building sustainable communities and on confronting social, economic, and environmental disparities through a land policies lens. Now, if you don't know what land policy is, you can join a whole lot of us, but that's why you're here, right? So Claremont Lincoln University, you may not know us either. We're small, we're young, we're an accredited, nonprofit, socially conscious graduate institution focused on developing new and needed forms of leadership to make the kinds of changes Lincoln Institute is trying to enact. Whether you're in business, nonprofits, public service, government, ethical, inclusive leaders who respect and include diverse perspectives, leaders who listen, learn, bring people together to collectively tackle equity and disparity challenges in their communities. And folks, we're purposely affordable. We work directly with the Lincoln Institute, and we still have $100,000 and 10,000 fellowships to award for those interested in the Masters in Public Administration. But enough about that. This is webinar 2 in a 3-webinar series. Now, in the first webinar, which you have the link on there, we looked at the history, the context, and what we did as a country post-Depression, post-World War II, carved structural racism into our communities, whether it was housing, the highways, where we put the schools, where parks weren't, all of those kinds of things that we just decided. They built structural racism in, and we talked about how you know that actually happened in the last webinar. And you saw something called a story map, but you all wanted to know more. The number of comments we got about, so what's a story map? And that's why we have the second webinar. Today, the webinar is all about the maps. And as the title says, these maps don't lie. They make racial inequity visible with geospatial data. They make all sorts of other disparities visible as well. You'll soon find that out. Bottom line, you have a map somewhere of your city, and the maps will let you see your history visually. And then you, together with your community, your city council, the mayors, your managers, you determine ways you want to make change, improve, and better serve your citizens, even if it's in your business, your nonprofit, where you live and work. So here's what's happening. First, we're going to look specifically in depth at one city and its story map. And a big shout out to Pomona, California, because they're in the hot seat today. They've been working as a team to create their story map with the Center for Geospatial Solutions, and you're going to see it. And then second, we'll address how you and your city can create a map. Now, let's go back to Pomona. Pomona is one of 3 cities engaged in a program we're testing. We'd love for you to test it too. It's a collaboration between CLU and the Lincoln Institute. Joining Pomona are the cities of Long Beach and Montebello, also in Southern California. Teams from these cities are actually in a certificate program, but they're working with the Lincoln Institute, building their story maps, looking at land policy, discovering inequities, discovering big ahas about things like health disparities, urban heat, all of those kinds of things. And through the program, they're actually developing scenarios as a team, building their community and taking action to create change. So without further ado, we've got to get you into the Pomona story map. And the best people to do that are today's experts from the Lincoln Institute Center for Geospatial Solutions, Brees Robertson and Chaz Bakuli. Now, just a little bit about them. Brees Robertson, more than 20 years of experience. She also has a new book, folks, leading teams to develop state-of-the-art geospatial solutions for land and people issues. She led the GIS planning and research unit at the Trust for Public Land, and she created mapping applications. You may have heard of these two. ParkScore, that's the one that ranks the city's park systems, and ParkServe, a park equity tool. In addition, she is looking at all sorts of other community-driven conservation and climate resilience planning methodologies. Now, today, she's moved to do game-changing GIS solutions for the Center for Geospatial Solutions at the Lincoln Institute. She's seeking solutions that communities like yours can use to solve shared land, water, climate, equity, and other issues you discover through your story map and other technologies. Now, to do that, you need a technology wizard. And added to Brees and her endless, relentless energy, you have Chaz, who's the wizard behind all technology. He leads the development of maps, geospatial applications like the story maps, but also open data hubs for Lincoln Institute. He leads comprehensive peer-reviewed mapping processes for Lincoln programs. You may have heard of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy. He worked with them to co-produce a map of the Colorado River Basin, in the news quite a bit lately. It showcases the area's geography, water use, the effects on communities and tribes in the basin. He's also the one building the geospatial tools that's helping legacy cities in the US, helping them to figure out equitable and just redevelopment and community improvement projects. And so, Brees, Chaz, that's a little bit about you. How are you? Are you ready for today?
We're doing great. We're excited.
All right. So first, folks, a couple housekeeping items. Q&A for the questions. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you have a tab that says Q&A. To help with all those technical questions, and even the question I saw that popped in, can we know who's participating and collect brief bios for a roster that could help? We have a person who's going to kind of answer behind the scenes as well, take notes and make sure we get back to you. We have expert Kevin McMaster. He is a GIS consultant for the Lincoln Institute, and he manages all aspects of geospatial projects for SimGeo, focused on community engagement, sustainable development, asset management, and smart city planning. To begin to address that first question, he was probably doing it behind the scenes. You'll see how that works if you post a question. We have more than 550 people who had registered. They represent communities. They represent cities across the country. They represent organizations and agencies devoted to structural racism. They represent corporations trying to think about conservation. They represent states that are coming in around the Colorado River Basin, and the list goes on, and we'll see if Kevin can get you more answers to that. We'll stop for questions midway and at the end. And just a reminder, we are being recorded and live streamed with closed captioning. And yes, all the recordings are available, the first webinar, this webinar, the next webinar, and you'll receive a resource packet within a few days, if not sooner, right after the webinar. And so with that, Brees and Chaz, let me get out of the spotlight and onto you.
All right, thank you, Lynn. Chaz, you can go to the next slide, please. And welcome everybody. A quick note, our friend and colleague Justin Madron cannot join us today. He's the GIS project manager and analyst at the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. And we want to thank him and the lab for providing redlining data and supporting the development of the story map that you'll see today. Next slide. At the Center for Geospatial Solutions, we are dedicated to bringing the capacity or bridging the capacity gap for communities and decision makers for inclusive access to powerful data, tools, and technologies. We focus on capacity building, partnerships, and last mile delivery that lead to actionable information that we can use to scale to meet rapidly accelerating social, economic, and environmental pressures. Next slide. And for those of you who aren't able to join the first webinar that Lynn mentioned, we think it's important to provide an overview of that. The president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Mac McCarthy, took us through a tour of how land policy decisions over the last century have reinforced health, economic, social, and political disadvantages based on race. He showed data and maps that tell the story of how decisions made during the Great Depression up to present day have shaped injustices and racial inequities in communities across America, and how they persist today across every aspect of quality of life for Black and Brown communities. We highly recommend that you watch this recorded webinar, and we'll drop a link to that into the chat right now. So today, Chaz and I are going to focus on how story maps engage communities and decision makers on the path towards durable, equitable change. We'll cover how the story map is a powerful tool to share data and knowledge of the history of these inequities in an accessible way that shines light on the truth of how past decisions keep communities from accessing wealth, health, quality of life, democracy, education, and other basic rights that all of us should share and have. Next slide. So as Lynn mentioned, I've been working with geospatial data and maps for a long time, for decades. And it wasn't until I saw some of these data sets come to life through storytelling that I really understood how many pervasive racial injustices have started through land use decisions made over the last century, and how they're still persisting today. So here are just a few examples. The interstate highway system, the largest infrastructure project of the century, carved paths through our cities, dividing and destroying thriving Black and Brown neighborhoods. These images are from a Bloomberg City Lab article, what it looks like to reconnect Black communities torn apart by highways. Again, I think we can put this link in the chat. I highly recommend checking out this digital article. And go to the next slide. So what this shows is the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was a thriving Black community for over a century, where the majority of the city's Black residents lived, worked, shopped, and worshiped. Next slide. But in 1956, the city, through the Federal Aid Highway Act, made the decision to run the highway directly through the neighborhood, demolishing it and displacing over 500 residents and tearing down businesses. Next slide. This is what it looks like now. There's a growing movement, though, to begin to right past wrongs caused by highway development. Reconnect Rondo is working to create a land bridge over the interstate that includes open space, residential, and businesses that benefit and reconnect this community. Next slide. Words and language matter. These words represent how the homeowners loan corporation, real estate assessors described and rated neighborhoods in the 1930s. These ratings influence what neighborhoods and residents that live there or influence how they could be eligible for home loans from banks. A and B grades, which are represented by green and blue, are the most desirable neighborhoods for loans, home loans, and the C and D grades represent declining neighborhoods with quote unquote detrimental influences, which they defined as having odors, pollution, and high numbers of Black, Hispanic, Mexican, and Asian populations. So you can see the egregious language here. They're talking about sewers, odors, treeless neighborhoods versus golf clubs, wooded and shaded. Next slide. So these descriptions have endured and have a lasting impact on these same neighborhoods today on life expectancy, health, home values, and more. These same neighborhoods are still experiencing the effects of decades of disinvestment. Next slide. This next example shows how redlining and topography are related. In this case, terrain and elevation, creating a stark economic divide between those living in communities in the hills versus those living in the flatlands adjacent to and among the railroad, the ports, and other industry where pollution is high, flooding occurs, and low property values. They have lower property values than those in the hills. And if you can go to the next slide, the DSL lab actually created this 3D model, so you can really get a sense of where these low-lying areas are and how the redlining grades affected those low-lying areas versus the greens and the blues neighborhoods, which are up on the hills. So these are just a few examples of how land use policies created current issues. This knowledge and information is powerful, and we're making it more available and accessible to everyone. And that is exactly what story maps are made to do. Next slide. So what are story maps? Story maps combine narrative, multimedia content like images, videos, and voice clips, and static and interactive maps to inform, engage, invite participation, and communicate complex or multidimensional issues. There's access through the web and can be viewed on a computer, phone, or tablet. They're easy to configure and create, and literally, you do not have to be a GIS expert to create simple story maps. We developed the story map that you're going to see here in just a minute with the staff from the planning department at the city of Pomona, and they engaged community members to provide some of the narrative and information that you'll see. We want to extend our thanks to those members of the city of Pomona's planning department for collaborating on the development of this story map. So we're going to pause for questions after Chaz shows the story map, but then jump back into how you can create a story map yourself, how you can access the data and the technology. So if you have questions about that as Chaz is going through the story map, just hold tight on those. We're going to get to those in the second part of the webinar. But for now, I'll hand it over to Chaz, and he's going to walk you through the Pomona story map. Chaz, take it away.
Great, thanks, Breeze, and thank you for that glowing introduction, Lynn, and thanks to everyone attending today. So building off Mac's webinar presentation, the previous webinar, we will show how land use practices and decisions have affected systemic inequities in Pomona with this story map, combining a narrative, multimedia content, and my favorite maps. So the story map will explore some of those decisions, and this story map link we can provide after. We'll be kind of going through a high-level overview and exploring the story map, but the story map does have a lot more detail into it that I'll be going over today, so we'll provide that after this webinar. So with maps, we can clearly see how redlining and freeway development has affected communities all over the United States. This map here shows the Los Angeles area and the surrounding area. And what we can see here, we can see the freeways, which are the orange lines. The majority of those freeways are going through either the red or the yellow neighborhoods. Now, the goal for the story map, for anyone who reads it and for today, will to help people become more well-informed and understand how these policies have created inequities and have had a lasting impact on the community today. So before we get into some of the issues, we're going to give you a brief introduction into Pomona, starting with a brief history. So Pomona has had a long and interesting history, starting in the pre-colonial area, where the area was occupied by the Tonga Native Americans, to the present as the 7th largest city in LA County, with a population of over 151,000 residents. Now, geographically, Pomona is located in Los Angeles County. It is actually on the border of LA County and San Bernardino County, and is about 32.5 miles from Los Angeles. Pomona is located in Pomona Valley and is bordered by 8 cities, including Claremont. In Pomona, the average age is about 31.5, and about 70% of residents have a high school diploma, and about 46% have some college experience. The income per capita is just under $21,000, and the average unemployment rate is about 12.7%. So now that we've had that brief introduction into redlining, let's talk about redlining in Pomona. So this quote from The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, explains that residential segregation in every metro area in the US was a result of a hidden public policy known as redlining. Now, if you're not too familiar with redlining or don't know what it is, redlining was the process of ranking neighborhoods based on loan worthiness to prospective home buyers in the 1930s. Neighborhoods were ranked on a scale from A, which is the best, the green, to D, which is the worst and riskiest. The maps use a legend based off of colors, and hence the term redlining. Many of the red graded neighborhoods were communities of color and other minorities. So even though as redlining happened in nearly every major metropolitan area in the United States, Los Angeles and Pomona was included. And as part of the grading of each of the neighborhoods, each neighborhood was given a brief description. Within the lower graded neighborhoods in Pomona, a lot of the language that you'll see includes subversive, undesirable, or lower grade populations. And we'll walk through some of the grades and area descriptions of the redlined neighborhoods in Pomona in this section. So this first section is one of the green graded communities in Pomona, located near Ganesha Park. And if you look in the area description, you can see that residents are described as business and professional men, executives, and retired people. And in the additional remarks in the area description, it says that it protects against racial hazards. Moving over to South Pomona in this red tile, one of the red tiles in Pomona, we'll see that the remarks include text saying area which has degenerated due to infiltration of Mexicans. Now, if we go just north of Pomona to the neighboring city of Claremont, the text for the graded communities tend to be a little bit nicer compared to Pomona. So in this one, looking at the blue tile, located just north of Harrison Avenue, you'll see in the text that this area has a better rating and description than the southern part, and includes words such as proximity to Pomona College and Scripps College for women, both national institutions, as a distinctly favorable influence. We go just south of that, or just east of it, excuse me. We'll see here that this section is graded yellow or C, and has text involving maybe few better class Mexicans. So these grades and descriptions have a lasting impact on the communities that were graded, as making it difficult for people in certain areas to access financing, and thus make it harder, if not impossible, to become a homeowner. And homeownership is arguably the most significant indicator of intergenerational wealth, and the effects of these policies and practices are still in effect today. So now we'll go over and talk about transportation development and health disparities in Pomona. So as these redlining processes happened, one of the significant effects it had on the communities was where transportation and freeways namely were developed. A little background about Pomona. Pomona is surrounded and served by 2 interstate freeways and 3 state route freeways. So we'll go and talk about the locations of Pomona and how they have adverse effects on the health of the adjacent areas. So as Pomona is surrounded by 5 major freeways and/or highways, there are significantly higher rates of asthma within and around Pomona. Now this map here, based off of Cal Enviro screen data, with red shows the asthma rates by census tracts, with the more red polygon is being worse. So based off of this data and map, Pomona has an average of being in the 60th percentile, while the average for Los Angeles County is in the 51st percentile, and the state average is in the 49th percentile. So we'll go through the 5 major freeways and highways and see how they have affected the areas around them. So the first one we'll take a look at is indicated by this green line going through the city here, is the I-10, which is one of the most significant or most important freeways in the United States. And known as the San Bernardino Freeway, it's one of the most trafficked highways, and in Pomona, it runs directly adjacent to 4 schools and 1 park, and the adjacent census tracts have a high asthma percentile value of 77. Next freeway we'll look at is the State Route 57, which serves as a significant freeway connector between the greater Los Angeles basin, as well as Pomona and the San Gabriel Valley. And running along the western side of the city, the freeway goes by 1 school and 1 park, and the adjacent census tracts have an average asthma rating of 67. The next route we'll look at is the 71. And the 71, also known as the Orange Freeway, connects Pomona and the San Gabriel Valleys with the rest of Riverside County. It is known as a common alternative to the State Route 57, and it is adjacent or it goes through 4 schools and has asthma rates of 70. Next route we'll look at is the State Route 60. And this is on the south side of the screen, and it is an important highway because it is typically used by long haul trucks that go throughout the country. And the adjacent census tracts to this highway have another high value of 70. Finally, the last route we'll look at is the State Route 210, which is this green line that's actually just north of the city. While it doesn't actually run by the city or is adjacent to the city, it serves as an important connector to the rest of Southern California, as multiple freeways that go through Pomona intersect with it. So what we can see here from this map is that a lot of the freeways, as well as having high asthma rates in the adjacent census tracts, also go by a lot of the schools and parks, and having a huge impact on the younger and future generations of Pomona and around Pomona. The next thing we'll take a look at is health equity and environmental justice in Pomona. So because of the redlining grades and subsequent disinvestment in these neighborhoods and communities, there are significant long-lasting consequences that have affected health equity and environmental justice in Pomona. In the area descriptions, as Bruce noted before, many of the A grades had much more desirable wording and language compared to the lower grades, such as golf club and wooded in the A grades, and sewers, odors, and treeless in the D grades. So first we have to ask ourselves, what is health equity? So the World Health Organization describes health equity as the absence of unfair, unavoidable differences among groups of people. And it can include many social determinants that go into health equity, including education access and quality, healthcare and quality, neighborhood and built environment, social and community contexts, and economic stability. In these following maps, we'll take a look at some metrics that can be used to look at health equity in Pomona. In terms of how health equity affects Pomona, the city of Pomona surveyed some residents within Pomona, and we've created a map here where you can kind of go through and see some of the responses that some citizens of Pomona had to what health equity means to them. Some of the common responses that they found were that their neighborhood had poor air quality, or that the general conditions of the streets, sidewalks, and general infrastructure were bad. So the first metric that we'll take a look at to measure health equity is the Social Vulnerability Index from the Center for Disease Control. So the CDC measures potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on external health. This index uses 15 variables across 4 themes, including socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing type and transportation. A higher value or score indicates more vulnerability. And they are graded by the census tract. In Pomona, the average is about 0.695, while the average in Los Angeles County is 0.628. Another way to look at public health, overall health of the community, is tree cover. Trees provide benefits such as shade, better air circulation, and as we'll see, helps lower the urban heat island effect. Across the redlining grades, the average tree height and grade have a positive relationship, with the better graded tiles, such as A, having a much taller average tree height compared to the D and the lower graded tiles. Typically, taller trees provide more benefits than shorter trees. In this map here, we employed a swipe function so you could see where some of those trees are in relation to the CDC SVI index census tracts. So in Pomona, tree cover accounts for about 29% of overall city land. Now we'll talk about urban heat islands. So in case you don't know, urban heat islands are areas that experience warmer temperatures than the surrounding areas. In Pomona, there's a higher concentration along the intersection of the freeways, as well as the eastern side of Pomona. This map also employs a swipe function, so you can see where some of those urban heat islands are in relation to trees, as well as the SVI index from the CDC. Next, we'll talk about parks and open space. And Pomona has about 28 parks, which leads to about 69% of residents within a 10-minute walking distance which on a positive note is a lot higher than the national average of 55%. However, in terms of overall city land, only about 1% is used for parks, although the city is looking to increase that, which we'll talk about in a bit. So here on this map from the Trust for Public Lands Park Serve, we show the locations of parks, which is the darker green areas, 10-minute walk service area, which is the green areas, and importantly, the priority areas for new parks, which are indicated by the purple polygons. So as we can see here within the Pomona boundaries, there are a lot of purple areas, which would be great spots to create new parks within Pomona. Finally, the last metric that we'll take a look at in Pomona to measure health equity is the National Risk Index from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Now, the National Risk Index uses expected annual loss, social vulnerability, and community resilience across 18 natural hazards to score census tracts with a higher value indicating greater risk. In Pomona, the average for the census tracts within the city is 22.79, meaning 73.9% of census tracts in the entire United States have a lower score. So now that we've talked about some of the health equity issues within Pomona, we can now talk about how these issues stem from the original zoning map first adopted in 1949. Since then, there have been certain trends that have affected the development of Pomona. So this map shows the zoning map of Pomona, and there are a lot of colors and things you see in the legend, but we'll kind of walk through. But when you get the story map in your own hands, you can kind of explore more. So one example that we'll take a look at is Reservoir Street. So Reservoir Street is a major corridor in the easternmost portion of Pomona. And in the original Los Angeles County redlining map, areas just west of Reservoir Street were categorized as in decline and largely owned by low-income labor class. Because of this, and still to this day, this area is zoned as R2, also known as the multiple family zone, which in the early 20th century was often used for low-income African-American and Mexican communities. Additionally, these higher dense zones are intentionally placed next to the commercial and industrial zones, which is this area of multiple blue polygons that you see, and act as a physical buffer to the single family residential zones. Today in Pomona, objective data indicates that over 90% of the Hispanic population reside in these industrial and high density zones, which is indicated by the different shades of pink on this map, with a darker shade meaning a higher Hispanic population, while conversely, the majority of the white population, which is indicated by the different shades of blue on this map, is located away from the industrial and or higher density areas. And with this white map, you can kind of toggle between and see the difference between the Hispanic and white population. So now, looking ahead and next steps, while there has been a history of structural racism and land use and policies in Pomona in the past, the city of Pomona is committed to changing these issues through 4 key initiatives. The initiatives that we'll be talking about are zoning updates, updating the park master plan, a citywide historic context, and public health fellows. So as we just talked about, the current zoning map was first implemented in the 1950s, and over the next year and a half, the city will begin updating its zoning ordinance and map. Additionally, the city will be updating its parks master plan, which will involve evaluating the conditions of the park, as well as the feasibility of new park development. Currently, Pomona has about 1 acre of park land per 1,000 residents, but they're looking to increase that to about 3 acres per 1,000 residents. Next, through a grant funded by the California Office of Historic Preservation, the city will complete a historic context statement, which will recognize contributions and resources within and by communities of color in Pomona. And finally, through a grant funded by the California Board of State and Community Corrections, Pomona will be hiring 2 public health fellows who will work across multiple departments to connect planning and land use issues with multiple variables such as public health, code and law enforcement, and other related issues. And finally, once you view the story map on your own, we do have some additional resources that give some more background, context, and information to the information that we talked about. And if you'd like to get in touch with the Pomona City staff, we do have their link here, so you can get in touch with them directly. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Brice.
All right, thank you, Chaz. Well, hopefully you can see how powerful story maps are, bringing data, narrative, images together to really tell the story, in this case, about how land use decisions have created and affected neighborhoods in Pomona. And so the same data and information can really be used for any community. A lot of the data that Chaz showed is readily available for a lot of communities across the country. So with that, we're going to take just a quick pause and take maybe 1 or 2 questions before we dive into how you can create a story map. And I did also want to just say that, working with Claremont Lincoln University, we do plan to make courses available that will teach you how to do this yourselves through the different certificate and master's programs. So with that, questions, Kevin and Lynn?
So Brice, one that goes back to the asthma, and it is this: can you explain the asthma index difference between the Highway 10 and 210? Does that make sense to you? There were some questions about people not knowing necessarily the asthma data or why there was that difference. Can you explain more the highways and asthma interplay?
Yeah, I think we'd have to explore the data more, which is the great thing about story maps, because we can do that in GIS. But my guess is that that might be related to zoning adjacent to those highways. But Chaz, I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, what we can see just based off of the data is that a lot of the higher asthma rates by census tracts are directly adjacent to the freeways, such as the 10, while looking back and comparing the rest of the census tracts that aren't near freeways, not just within Pomona, but around Pomona, don't have as high a value as the ones located next to the freeways.
Thanks. Here's the next one. I've got 2 more, if you can do them. Just really quickly, where do you find the original redlining maps? And do they exist for all cities?
Yeah, I think Kevin's going to put that in the chat right now.
Excellent. Great.
Let me just say one thing. Not all of the cities have redline data has been digitized yet. So Justin Madron at the University of Richmond, they're working on pulling those original maps out of the National Archives and digitizing those. And then you can also find those available on Esri's ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World.
And then just to check whether I'm correct or not, the language that's used in the map actually comes from the actual documents from city history, correct?
In the story map?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. And then finally, was the community involved in doing the story map? Was it a city team? How does it usually play out? When does the community get to be involved?
Well, that's a good question. Chaz did show one example of how the city did reach out to community members to identify health equity. There are a lot of engagement tools that you can build into story maps, whether it's surveys. You can work with community groups to build the narrative that goes into the story maps as well. And there are a lot of other ways to engage communities using GIS, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit.
So, and just a quick kind of technical that I don't know that Kevin has gotten to or knows. Have you used the census block demographic data to gain finer resolution in your analyses, or does that come next, or how does census block data work?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly can. You have a limited number of attributes that are associated with the census block level versus the census block group and tract. So yes, you certainly can use that, and you can use that information to even downscale data and information. We don't have it in this map, but totally available to use in different ways. So
what I'm hearing you say is a story map is kind of a living document, and it can continue to grow, engage, involves people's personal stories, cities reach out. It literally is a living history into the present. Is that possible?
Lynn, that is such a great way to describe it. Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, we do intend to continue to work with Pomona and other cities to update these story maps over time. And of course, when they go through their planning processes and they start implementing new policies, new changes, and funding, some of these plans that they have on the table here, data is going to change and the story is going to change. So we'll update that over time.
Cool. And that was actually a person writing in, seeing that ideal. So with that, take it away on your second half, Brees and Chaz.
All right, great. So now we're going to get into the how-to, and Chaz is going to start us off here.
Great, thanks, Brees. So how are story maps used? We've kind of provided an example with the Pomona story map of how it could be used in terms of delivering public information. But story maps have a wide array of ways it can be used and topics it can be used for, including for advocacy, public engagement, virtual tours, delivering public information, education, and crowdsourcing, just to name a few. The great thing about story maps is that there's not one way that it has to be used or it can be used. So what do you need to create a story map? So as Brees indicated earlier in today's webinar, little to no GIS experience is really needed to create a story map. The only thing that is definitely required to create a story map is an ArcGIS online account. And with story maps, there's three different tiers or user types that you can have to create a story map. The first one is a public user or a public account. This type of account is completely free, and while it is limited in the stuff that you can do in the story map, you are able to create your general story and can create express maps, which are some of the basic maps that don't involve too much data and kind of just show where things are or where places are going. The next type of account you could have, and this one is created relatively recently and is just for story maps, is what's called a storyteller. And the cool and great thing about this is basically an ArcGIS online account that is catered just for creating story maps. So from this, you have access to pretty much everything that StoryMaps offers, as well as being able to create maps and content from ArcGIS online data, or your organization, ArcGIS, if your organization has that, as well as from Esri Living Atlas, which is a Esri curated database, which has all sorts of great data and applications that can be used. And finally, the last tier is the creator or GIS professional user. And this is very similar to Storyteller, but the only difference is you can create your own web maps and scenes, as well as do it in ArcGIS Pro and upload it to StoryMaps. And before you kind of go into and dive into these different accounts, you might want to check with your organization, because it's very likely you might already have access to this if you have been using Esri or ArcGIS Online in some way. So now that we know what do you need to create a story map and how they can be used, what are the steps to create a story map? So we've kind of identified and listed kind of general steps to create a story map. Of course, each one could be tailored and a little bit different, but these are the 7 major steps that I've noticed when creating a story map. So the first one is you want to identify your story. What is the story you're trying to tell? Has that story already been told through other story maps or other forms? And what data is needed? Next step is identifying your audience. Is your audience going to be wide-ranging and very general, or is it going to be to a specific group or population? Based off of this, your story map can be very high level and generic, or if it's something that's going to be very specific, you can really dive into the details and create more high resolution maps or more detail-oriented maps. After that, you want to identify the goals of your story. After reading the story map, what should the main takeaways be that a reader gains from the story map? Is it to be informed about something? Is it to learn about a cause? There are many goals that you'll want to make sure you set at the onset of your story map, so you're clear about that. Next thing you'll want to do is to give your story a rhythm. And the way I've always accomplished this is always by creating an outline with a start and a finish and just filling in from there. You want to make sure that your story map grabs your reader's attention. You want to make sure you're using media and maps well with your narrative and text, and making sure you're not just creating a long article. And you want to make sure your story map has a structure with sections that work well together and aren't completely separate and diverge from each other. Next, you'll want to use static and interactive maps and media. In my experience, creating story maps and reading story maps There are different types of media and ways it can be used to enhance your story, as well as keep your reader interested. And you'll also want to see if there's some existing maps and media that can be leveraged from ArcGIS Online and Esri Living Atlas. Next, you'll want to keep your story map short and sweet. You don't want your story map to be dragging on too relentlessly, as a reader can get bored. And finally, you want to end your story map with a call to action. Does your story end with something the reader can do or provide a resolution to your story? So these are the steps that I've always used and kept in mind when creating a story map. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Brees.
All right, you can advance to the next slide, please. All right, so these are resources. They're not linked here because what we're going to do is put links to each one of these in the chat right now. But these are resources for story maps. A lot of these story maps were created by Esri, Alan Carroll and his team there, that tell you, what is a story map? So there's a story map for that. The myriad uses of story maps, how do you get started to create those story maps? There are some really great blogs that talk about using story maps. And ArcGIS, Learn ArcGIS is a website that you can access that will walk you through tutorials on how to get started with creating an ArcGIS Online account and creating story maps. And literally, you do not have to be a GIS expert or have any GIS expertise or experience to create a story map. There's a tutorial on learnarcgis.com that'll get you up and running, and you can have a story map created within 30 minutes. So next slide. It's critical, and Lynn, this goes back to the question that was asked, to involve the community because they hold the deep collective knowledge of their place and they have that relationship with that place and with each other. And so story maps are just one of an array of tools that are available to engage the community. So from paper maps like this picture here in the bottom left-hand corner where you can create maps, print them out, take them to meetings with magic markers and have community members draw on them and provide input on what their desires and needs are, to digital applications like the little screenshot in the center there that's a survey 123, where you can get people's thoughts or get their desires through a survey application. Or through citizen science applications and field apps like this. This picture in the right-hand corner is an organization called Africa People and Wildlife, and they're using an application in the field to track when predators are coming into their area when they're herding their cattle through the countryside. So next slide, Chaz. So data, where do you get it? Chaz touched on this a little bit, but there are many ways to access data freely available, and also maps and applications. I'm going to talk about just a few of those here. And as I go through these, Kevin's going to put the links in the chat, so I'll be sure to grab those as they come up. ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World provides an extensive library of our authoritative and curated data that you can search based on themes and topics. And many municipalities are now serving up their data through open data portals or hubs. Like LA, for example, has a really great Geo Hub. You can Google that and see how they organize and share their data and information. And next slide. So there are also, in addition to story maps, many online applications that let you go deeper in interacting with the data. So these are freely available, and you can explore data, you can overlay information for insights, you can even do some analysis on some of these websites. So there was a question earlier, where do I get the redlining data? Well, this is a good application where you can go in and explore the data and you can download it. And many of these sites also let you connect directly to their data without having to download it through ArcGIS Online or your own GIS account. So you can go to the next slide. And Chaz mentioned the Trust for Public Lands ParkServe application. So this is, again, you can access this freely available online. You can zoom into those areas of high park need based on equity indicators. And look at where new parks could go that could serve the most people. And next slide. And EPA has two really great tools, the EnviroAtlas, which looks at the economic benefits of, or ecosystem service benefits of land, and EJ Screen actually helps you identify environmental justice issues in your community. So these have, two web applications have a ton of data, from health data to land cover to pollution information. And again, you can explore the data here online, and a lot of these data sets are available through ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World. Next slide. Esri also has a Maps for Public Policy website. This is fairly new, but they've brought together data, apps, and maps that are specifically used for policy, for informing policy, changing policy, creating new policies. So I highly recommend checking this out. And then on the next slide, they've also created a racial equity GIS hub. And so this is, again, a place where you can go, and they've already curated and pulled authoritative data from many different sources, from the national to state to local level, that you can access to create your own maps or to explore online. So we're dropping those links in the chat now, and hopefully you can access those. So I want to acknowledge that decades of policy and these issues can't be unraveled overnight. But this information and collective community knowledge can start to lay the groundwork for power and capacity building and change. Knowledge is the first step to action. Just knowing what has happened is the first step, and story maps and data can help us understand that. These policies and information are not news to the communities that have a deep history with these injustices and live in these places. But many people have never seen it on a map, seen the language used or how it all played out historically. So these story maps support communities to understand and use the truth of the past to create a roadmap for systemic, durable, and equitable change that is driven by bottom-up engagement. So next slide. So we'll pause and take questions here, but please join the next webinar in the series. And let's see, let's put a link to that webinar so we have a date where people can actually register for that. But in this next webinar, it's building upon the first one and this one now. And then you'll be learning in the third webinar about strategies to find collaborative stakeholders, work with communities to build power, and how to uncover political will for change and to activate it. So before we stop here and ask for questions, Lynn mentioned that I wrote a book. It's called Protecting the Places We Love, and it is available through your local or favorite bookseller. And Esri's actually making it available to everyone on this webinar for 40% off the list price through midnight tonight. So if you're interested in this book, it does cover a lot of the things that we've talked about today and so much more, like strategic planning, community engagement, and how to use GIS to map, model, and analyze a lot of these issues. So you just need you can Google Protecting the Places We Love and put in the code CLU 2021 to get that discount. So with that, we'll pause here, and Lynn and Kevin, we can open it up for questions. Oh, let me just say, here's our contact information. And then Justin, even though he couldn't be here today, if you have specific questions about the redlining data and you want to access that, here's his contact information. And if you have questions for the city of Pomona, they also provided their contact information here.
So Breeze, really interesting comment, and it comes from the East Coast, and there were several comments about the history of the East Coast and cities there. And so if you could also just comment on the range of cities, what legacy cities are, and what they mean in a minute. But the point is this, that in the community of Newton, Massachusetts, it's a very affluent suburb of Boston, and maybe you know that. I'm sure Mac and others would know that from the Lincoln Institute, since they're based out of Boston. But they didn't redline their small, historically African American community. They tended to redline neighborhoods with lots of mixed ethnic groups. And so the premise here was, the question is this: my sense is that the risk the FHA and others wanted to avoid was only sometimes with specific ethnic or racial groups, but always with a mix of ethnic groups, economic classes, or land uses, single, multifamily, as well as residential, non-residential. Is that true? Does that align with your experience, or do you know we need to field that to someone else?
Well, I mean, what I do know, and Justin talks about this a lot, is that D grade comes along with the term detrimental influences. And that combination of, they talked about immigrants with that language, with a bunch of different ethnicities moving into neighborhoods, like moving into neighborhoods was another detrimental influence. They have a lot of sort of definitions that they used to apply that D grade, but I'm sure Justin can go much more deeper into that because this is what they're studying.
Yeah, and Justin, it was unfortunate he wasn't able to join us today as planned. So the legacy cities, who are the legacy cities, and what is the Lincoln Institute and Center for Geospatial Solutions doing with legacy cities?
Yeah, legacy cities are cities that really started out with a boom, with some type of a real anchor economic opportunity, like, creating a steel mill or creating, an automotive factory, things like that, that did really well for a long time. And then, they kind of dried up and went away. But because those cities, economies and quality of life and all of those things that make communities great communities were dependent upon those people that were working in those mills or factories, that went away. And so they haven't recovered many of them. And Lincoln has a legacy cities program. We're working with 98 legacy cities in the Northeast now to help them address a lot of these issues and figure out how to build their capacity again for economic development and quality of life.
So thanks so much. And the last one, what's your vision? What's your dream, Brees, for what happens, what the Center for Geospatial Solutions can do?
Well, we really want to put these enabling technologies into the hands of not only the decision makers, but the communities, so that we have more of a bottom-up swell of people using this technology for durable change. So that is really our vision and our goal. And we want to make this technology as accessible, as inclusive, and as available as possible to all communities across the country. So if anybody has any questions, you want to just talk about how you even get started with this, if you have a big project you want to talk through, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk with you.
So thank you so much, folks. And a thank you to Pomona and to Long Beach and Montebello, because there are 3 cities testing this joint program between Claremont Lincoln University and the Lincoln Institute to really develop the 3 webinars and actually do something with it, to actually make a change, make a significant difference as part of the educational program collectively as a city with its community. And the 3rd webinar, folks, is all about involving the community, building the coalition, mounting that political will, finding the resources, and engaging collectively to make a difference. And with that, this was webinar 2. Don't forget about the MP of the $100,000 in fellowships. You can contact me about that. Webinar 3 is in 2 weeks. And on that, community, thank you so much on behalf of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Claremont Lincoln University. Have a great rest of the day. Go out and make a difference.